It was a bright, bustling morning at the city's busiest airport, where travelers from all walks of life moved with purpose. Among them was Kevin Miles, a highly skilled aerospace engineer with years of experience working behind the scenes to keep the aviation world running smoothly. Kevin wasn't just any engineer. He was one of the few African-American professionals in his field, a man who had worked tirelessly to break barriers and earn respect in an industry where people like him was still a rarity. Today, however, Kevin's focus wasn't on engineering diagrams or safety protocols. He had a critical meeting scheduled in the airport's control tower, a visit he had been invited to make weeks earlier to present a groundbreaking design that could revolutionize air traffic operations. As Kevin approached the entrance to the towering structure, carrying a sleek black briefcase that held the fruits of his labor, he couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and pride. This was his moment, a chance to showcase his expertise and prove that innovation knew no boundaries. But as he neared the secure entry gate, something unexpected happened. A stern-faced security officer, standing firmly with arms crossed, blocked Kevin's path. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your clearance," the officer said curtly, his eyes scanning Kevin from head to toe. Kevin calmly reached into his jacket pocket, producing the necessary documentation, which bore both his credentials and the formal invitation to the tower. The officer glanced at the papers briefly, but didn't move to let him pass. Instead, he frowned, his tone turning cold. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in." Kevin's heart skipped a beat. "There must be some mistake," he replied evenly, though a knot was forming in his stomach. "I was personally invited by the operations director. You can check with them." The officer cut him off sharply. "I don't make the rules. You're not getting in. Step aside." Kevin felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't the first time he faced subtle, or not so subtle, pushback in his career. But being denied entry to a space he had every right to access, simply because someone decided he didn't belong, was a new low. The stares from passers-by burned into his skin as the officer's voice grew louder, drawing unnecessary attention. Kevin clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "Look," he said, keeping his tone measured. "I've worked hard to get here. I have documentation. I'll wait while you verify it, but I'm not stepping aside until this is resolved." The officer's response was to call for backup. Moments later, 2 more security personnel appeared, their presence a clear escalation. Kevin took a deep breath, realizing this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something uglier. The whispers from onlookers grew louder, the situation spiraling in a direction Kevin hadn't anticipated. But Kevin wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. What happened next would change everything, not just for Kevin, but for the entire airport. What Kevin did in response to this blatant act of exclusion would bring operations to a grinding halt, forcing those in power to confront not only their actions but the broader implications of their biases. And as the events of that day unfolded, one thing became clear. Kevin Miles wasn't just an engineer. He was a force to be reckoned with. But what exactly did he do? And how could one man's determination shake the foundation of an entire system? Stay tuned. This story is far from over. Kevin stood firm, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He was no stranger to moments like this, instances where assumptions were made before words could even be exchanged, where explanations didn't matter because judgment had already been passed. It wasn't always this blatant, though. Most of the time, the biases he encountered came wrapped in smiles, polite words, or an air of misunderstanding. This, however, was different. It was deliberate. The backup officers didn't bother to address Kevin directly. Instead, they spoke quietly with the first officer, occasionally glancing in Kevin's direction, their expressions unreadable. Kevin didn't need to hear their words to know the conversation wasn't in his favor. He tightened his grip on his briefcase, feeling the weight of years of hard work contained within it. His design, a sophisticated algorithm meant to streamline air traffic coordination, had the potential to save airlines millions of dollars while improving safety and efficiency. It was the reason he'd been invited here in the first place, and now it felt like none of that mattered. As the minutes dragged on, Kevin thought back to how this all began. He'd grown up in a small, predominantly black neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. His fascination with flight started when he was a boy, watching planes roar overhead as he lay in the grass near O'Hare International Airport. While other kids idolized athletes or musicians, Kevin was captivated by engineers and inventors, people who built things, solved problems, and made the impossible possible. He knew early on that he wanted to be one of them, even if the odds weren't in his favor. The path to becoming an aerospace engineer hadn't been easy. From the moment he declared his ambitions in high school, Kevin was met with skepticism, even from teachers. "Are you sure you want to aim that high?" one guidance counselor had asked, her tone dripping with doubt. But Kevin had ignored the naysayers, throwing himself into math and science with a determination that left no room for distractions. Scholarships and late nights of studying eventually led him to one of the country's top engineering schools, where he excelled despite being one of the few black students in his program. After graduation, Kevin quickly proved himself in the workforce, earning accolades for his innovative ideas and problem-solving skills. Yet, even as he climbed the ranks, the sense of having to prove himself over and over again never went away. He wasn't just an engineer. He was a black engineer in an industry that often treated him like an anomaly. Still, Kevin didn't let it stop him. If anything, it fueled him. That fire was what brought him to this moment, standing at the base of the airport's control tower, his career-defining project clutched in his hands. But now, as the officers continued their quiet deliberation, Kevin felt that familiar knot of frustration twist in his stomach. He could have argued, raised his voice, demanded they call the operations director who had invited him. But he knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. It wasn't just his reputation at stake, it was his safety too. Instead, he kept his posture calm and his expression neutral, though every fiber of his being wanted to shout. The crowd of onlookers had grown, their curiosity evident. Some glanced at Kevin with sympathy, others with indifference. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Kevin wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or uneasy. Social media could be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it could expose injustice. On the other, it could distort the narrative. But Kevin didn't have time to dwell on that. He needed to think, to act, but carefully. Just then, a woman emerged from the crowd. She was dressed in a pilot's uniform, her strides confident and purposeful. Her name tag read Captain Lisa Alvarez, and her presence immediately commanded attention. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The officers straightened, their demeanor shifting slightly in the presence of someone with authority. The first officer hesitated before responding. "Just a security protocol. This gentleman doesn't have clearance to enter the tower." Captain Alvarez turned her gaze to Kevin, her sharp eyes taking in the situation. "Doesn't have clearance. Did you check his credentials?" she asked, her tone skeptical. We're about to," the officer stammered. "Then do it," Alvarez said firmly. "This man is clearly a professional. You don't detain someone like this without verifying first." She looked at Kevin and offered a small nod, as if to say, "I've got your back, asterisk." For a brief moment, Kevin felt a flicker of relief, but the officers still didn't move. They exchanged uneasy glances, their hesitation speaking volumes. That was when Kevin realized the issue wasn't about protocol or paperwork. They weren't interested in checking his credentials because, to them, it didn't matter. They'd already made up their minds. Kevin met Alvarez's gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I think it's bigger than that." Her expression hardened as she seemed to understand what he meant. "Wait here," she said, turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the tower. Kevin watched her go, unsure of what would happen next. She was clearly someone with influence, but even that might not be enough to cut through the barriers he faced. Minutes felt like hours as Kevin stood there, his mind racing. He thought about his colleagues, people who respected his expertise but didn't truly understand the challenges he faced outside the office. He thought about the young engineers he mentored, many of whom looked up to him as proof that it was possible to succeed in an industry that wasn't built for them. And he thought about his family, the sacrifices they'd made to support his dreams, and how proud they'd be of him if they could see him now. But pride wasn't enough. Kevin didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to change the system. He wanted to make it so the next generation of engineers wouldn't have to fight these same battles. And in that moment, he decided he wasn't going to let this incident slide. The officers continued to linger, their presence a silent reminder of the obstacles Kevin faced. But Kevin didn't flinch. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The system might have tried to shut him out, but Kevin wasn't the kind of man to stay silent. What he did next would make sure of that. As Kevin stood there, his phone still in hand, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. It was soft but carried an edge of curiosity. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Kevin turned to see a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, holding a coffee cup and wearing a visitor badge. She didn't look like she worked at the airport, but her eyes held a genuine concern. Kevin nodded slightly, though he could tell his expression said otherwise. "Just a bit of a misunderstanding," he said, not wanting to explain the full weight of the situation to a stranger. But the woman didn't move on. "I saw what happened," she said, lowering her voice. "I don't know all the details, but it didn't look like they were giving you a fair chance." She hesitated, then added, "My dad's a pilot here. I've seen how things work sometimes." Kevin raised an eyebrow at her, unsure if she was being nosy or genuinely trying to help. "And how do things work?" he asked, his tone more curious than confrontational. She glanced at the officers, who were still hovering nearby, then looked back at Kevin. "Let's just say they don't always play by the book, especially if they think no one's watching." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she added, "If you need someone to back you up, I'm happy to help." Kevin wasn't sure what to make of her offer. He didn't even know her name. But there was something about the way she said it, like she understood what he was dealing with on a level most people wouldn't. "Thanks," he said finally. "I might take you up on that." Before she could respond, Captain Alvarez reappeared, her expression a mix of determination and frustration. She walked straight up to Kevin, ignoring the officers entirely. "I just spoke with the operations director," she said, her voice low but firm. "They confirmed you're supposed to be here. I gave them a piece of my mind for this mess." Kevin felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the lingering anger in the pit of his stomach. "Did they say why this happened in the first place?" he asked. Alvarez hesitated, glancing at the officers, who were suddenly very interested in their radios. "Let's just say it was a miscommunication," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't buy that explanation. "They're letting you in now. But if I were you, I'd file a formal complaint. This kind of thing shouldn't happen." Kevin nodded, though he knew a complaint wouldn't fix the bigger issue. He'd seen it too many times before, apologies and promises of reviewing protocols that never led to real change. Still, he appreciated Alvarez's support. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. As he followed her toward the tower entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The officers didn't stop him this time, but their lingering glares spoke volumes. Kevin knew their actions weren't just about him as an individual, they were part of a larger systemic problem. And while he was relieved to be moving forward, he couldn't ignore the fact that he'd been forced to fight for something that should have been automatic. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was entirely different. The hum of activity, the faint beeping of radar screens, and the soft chatter of air traffic controllers created a sense of order and precision. Kevin had always admired this environment, a place where split-second decisions and careful coordination kept thousands of lives safe every day. But today, the space felt heavier, like it carried the weight of everything that had just happened. He was greeted by the operations director, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor who apologized profusely for the misunderstanding. Kevin shook his hand and exchanged pleasantries, but he could tell the man was eager to move on and avoid any deeper discussion about the incident. Kevin didn't push it for now. He had a presentation to deliver, and he wasn't about to let anyone derail the opportunity he'd worked so hard for. As he set up his materials, Kevin's mind raced with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to focus solely on the task at hand, to let his work speak for itself and prove to everyone in the room that he belonged here. But another part of him couldn't let go of what had just happened. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been told, in ways both subtle and blatant, that they didn't belong. And he knew that if he stayed silent, he'd be letting those people down. The presentation went smoothly, his innovative designs sparking interest and excitement among the attendees. Kevin answered their questions with ease, his confidence growing with each passing minute. By the time he finished, it was clear that his work had made an impression. The operations director even hinted at future collaborations, a sign that Kevin's contributions were being recognized. But as Kevin packed up his briefcase, the weight of the morning's events settled back on his shoulders. He couldn't ignore the irony of the situation, being celebrated for his brilliance while having to fight for basic respect. And he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. As he left the tower, Kevin noticed the young woman from earlier standing near the terminal. She caught his eye and gave him a small wave, as if to say, "Asterisk, I'm still here if you need me." Asterisk. Kevin nodded in acknowledgement, grateful for her quiet support. Back in his car, Kevin sat for a moment, staring out at the planes taking off and landing in the distance. He thought about the boy he used to be, lying in the grass near O'Hare, dreaming of the skies. He thought about the obstacles he faced to get here, and the ones he still faced every day. And he thought about the people who were watching him now, the young engineers, the aspiring pilots, the dreamers who needed someone to show them it was possible. Kevin took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the bigger picture, about changing the system so no one else would have to fight the same battles. And as he started his car and pulled out of the parking lot, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Kevin drove home that evening, the hum of the city fading into the background as his mind replayed the day's events. The relief of successfully delivering his presentation couldn't fully override the simmering frustration. Every detail of his encounter with the officers clung to him like a stubborn shadow. He could hear the dismissive tone of their voices, feel the weight of their glares, and see the hesitation in their actions, as if his presence alone was a disruption to their carefully constructed order. It wasn't the first time he faced such treatment, but something about today felt different, bigger. At home, Kevin sat at his kitchen table, a laptop open in front of him. He typed furiously, words flowing as he recounted the incident in vivid detail. He wasn't sure where the story would go, whether it would end up as a formal complaint, an open letter, or simply a way to process his emotions. But he knew it couldn't stay bottled up inside him. The world needed to know that even in spaces of innovation and progress, there were still walls designed to keep people like him out. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Captain Alvarez. Kevin, I can't stop thinking about what happened today. If you're planning to take this further, count me in. People need to hear this. Kevin stared at the message for a moment, a spark of encouragement flickering to life. He hadn't expected her to follow up, but the fact that she did make him feel less alone in this fight. He quickly typed back, "Thanks, Captain. I appreciate that. I'll be in touch." As the days passed, Kevin's resolve only grew stronger. He reached out to colleagues, mentors, and even a few journalists he knew through professional networks, sharing his story in measured, thoughtful words. The responses varied. Some people expressed outrage and support, while others tried to downplay the incident, calling it an isolated case or a simple misunderstanding. But Kevin knew better. This wasn't just about a single event. It was about a culture that allowed these kinds of things to happen in the first place. Then, an unexpected twist came. A whistleblower within the airport contacted Kevin anonymously, providing him with internal communications that painted a troubling picture. The messages hinted at biases within certain security protocols and even revealed a pattern of complaints from others who had faced similar treatment. Kevin felt a chill as he read through the files. This wasn't just negligence, it was systemic. Fueled by this new information, Kevin decided to take action. He reached out to a local advocacy group that specialized in workplace equity, sharing everything he had. The group's leader, a charismatic lawyer named Janice Coleman, immediately saw the significance of Kevin's case. "This isn't just about you, Kevin," she said during their first meeting. "This could expose a much bigger problem, and it might just be the catalyst for real change. But you need to be ready for pushback." Kevin nodded. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. Speaking up could put his career on the line, not to mention his personal peace. But staying silent wasn't an option. He owed it to himself and to everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible in spaces they had every right to occupy. Social media exploded with commentary, some users rallying behind Kevin, while others dismissed his claims or accused him of overreacting. Kevin tried not to dwell on the negativity, but it wasn't easy. Every comment questioning his credibility felt like a personal attack, another wall he had to climb over just to be heard. Amid the growing attention, the airport issued a carefully worded statement, calling the incident unfortunate and promising to review their procedures. But the statement stopped short of admitting fault or addressing the deeper issues Kevin had raised. To Kevin, it felt like a hollow attempt to save face without making any real changes. As the pressure mounted, Kevin received another unexpected message, this time from the operations director who had hosted him at the tower. The man's tone was markedly different from their brief interaction after the presentation. "Kevin, I've been following the news. I didn't realize the extent of what happened that day. Let's talk. I want to understand your perspective." Kevin wasn't sure how to feel about the message. On one hand, it seemed like an opportunity to have a productive conversation with someone in a position of power. On the other hand, he couldn't help but wonder if it was just another attempt to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem. After some deliberation, he agreed to meet, but on one condition: Janice would come with him. The meeting took place in a neutral location, away from the airport. The director seemed nervous, his polished demeanor cracking slightly under the weight of the controversy. "I want you to know that what happened to you doesn't reflect the values we strive for at this airport," he began, his voice measured. Kevin didn't let him off the hook that easily. "With all due respect, it's not just about me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about the culture that allows incidents like this to keep happening. What are you doing to fix that?" The director shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for Kevin's directness. "We're reviewing our training and protocols," he said after a pause, "and we're committed to improving inclusivity and awareness among our staff." Janice leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "And how do you plan to hold people accountable? Because without accountability, reviewing protocols is just a nice way of saying you're doing nothing." The tension in the room was palpable, but Kevin didn't back down. This was the moment he'd been building toward, a chance to confront the very system that had tried to shut him out. And as he waited for the director's response, he could feel the weight of not just his own struggle, but the struggles of countless others who were counting on him to make a difference. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken truths. Kevin knew this wasn't the end of the fight. If anything, it was just the beginning. But he also knew that this moment, this confrontation, was a turning point. And whatever happened next, he was ready to face it head-on. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and suffocating. Kevin could feel the weight of the director's indecision hanging in the air, as if he were weighing the consequences of his next words. Then, just as it seemed like the conversation might move toward another empty promise, the door to the conference room creaked open. Kevin turned, his heart skipping a beat. A figure stepped into the room, and for a split second, he thought it was a mistake. Someone had walked in by accident, but then the door closed behind them with a soft click, and Kevin's blood ran cold. It was the same first officer from the airport. the one who had been the first to question Kevin's credentials. His uniform was crisp, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. He wasn't here by accident. Kevin's stomach tightened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer didn't answer immediately. He stood there, casting a glance at the director, who shifted uneasily in his chair. The officer's eyes finally met Kevin's, and there was something cold in them, something more calculated than Kevin had seen before. "I'm here to clear things up," the officer said slowly, his tone almost too calm, as if rehearsed. "I'm not sure what you've been told, but the situation at the tower wasn't what you think it was." Kevin's mind raced. The officer's presence wasn't a coincidence. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like someone had just turned the volume up on a faint alarm. Kevin exchanged a quick glance with Janice, whose expression had gone from cautious to watchful. She could sense a sudden change too. The director cleared his throat. "This is unexpected. Officer Thompson, I wasn't expecting you." His voice was tight, and it was clear that this meeting had just taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Officer Thompson stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. "I think you should hear the full story before the narrative starts to spin out of control." Kevin could feel his pulse quicken. "What are you implying?" His eyes were fixed on the officer, who had a habit of making vague statements that felt like veiled threats. Thompson took a slow breath, his gaze unwavering. "What I'm saying is, Kevin wasn't just a random engineer trying to get into the tower. He knew exactly what he was doing, and the project he was presenting isn't what he claims it to be." Kevin felt a sharp pang of disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" Janice leaned forward, her voice steady but with an edge. "You're accusing Kevin of what, exactly?" The officer's gaze flickered momentarily to the director, then back to Kevin. "I'm saying that the project you're working on, your algorithm, it's not your own. It's part of a larger, more sensitive operation, one that involves government contracts and private entities. What you're really trying to do isn't as innocent as you make it seem." Kevin's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled. "You're saying I'm involved in something illegal? Or—" The officer cut him off, his voice harder now. "What I'm saying is that you've been duped, Kevin. Your work, your genius, whatever you think you've developed, has been co-opted, and I can't let you present something that you don't fully understand the consequences of." The room fell into a tense silence. Kevin's thoughts spun wildly, trying to make sense of what was happening. This didn't add up. His algorithm had been his creation. It had been rigorously tested and refined, and the opportunity to present it had come after months of collaboration and approval. How could it be connected to something shady, something bigger asterisk? Janice's voice broke through the stillness, cool but sharp. "Are you accusing Kevin of being involved in some conspiracy? What exactly are you trying to say, officer?" Thompson didn't flinch. "I'm saying that this project, Kevin's so-called breakthrough, isn't his alone. There are forces at play here that even you don't understand. And if you go through with this presentation, the fallout won't just be on you, Kevin. It'll be on everyone who's been involved with this thing from the start." The weight of his words settled into the room like a thick fog, clouding everything. Kevin could feel his heart racing, but his thoughts were moving faster than his pulse, trying to connect the dots. What was he missing? Why had no one mentioned this before? "Is this about the government contracts?" Kevin asked, his voice barely audible, as if saying the words out loud might make them more real. Thompson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folder. Without breaking eye contact, he slid it across the table toward Kevin. "It's all in there," he said, his voice laced with a quiet finality. "The truth, you can read it, and maybe then you'll see how deep this goes." Kevin stared at the folder, his mind now flooded with more questions than answers. His instincts screamed at him to open it, to see what the officer had brought, but the same instincts also warned him that whatever was inside could change everything. The tension in the room was unbearable. Kevin's hand hovered over the folder, his fingers itching to unravel the mystery, but part of him feared what would happen once he did. The officer continued, "You think you're changing the world with your algorithm, but you're just a pawn in someone else's game. You don't even know who's pulling the strings." Kevin's mind raced. A pawn? A game? Who was he working for? What had he stumbled into? Everything he thought he understood was unraveling before him, and the more he tried to pull at the threads, the more tangled everything became. "Are you telling me that I'm part of something I don't even understand?" Kevin's voice was edged with disbelief, but there was an underlying thread of fear creeping into his words. This wasn't just about him being denied entry to the tower anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. Thompson leaned back, his face cold. "I'm telling you that the choices you make next could determine not just your future, but the future of a lot of people. And if you think this stops at your little project, you're dead wrong." Kevin's mind raced, but his body was frozen. The officer's words hung in the air, heavy with a promise of consequences too vast to fully grasp. What had he stepped into? What had started as a fight for respect, for equality, was now threatening to swallow him whole. With trembling hands, Kevin reached for the folder. Kevin's fingers brushed against the folder's smooth surface, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel Janice's eyes on him, but there was no turning back now. With a steady hand, he lifted the folder and flipped it open, scanning the papers inside. His breath hitched as the words began to sink in. What he read didn't just shake him, it shattered everything he thought he knew. The documents revealed confidential communications between powerful players in the tech and government sectors. Kevin's algorithm wasn't just a personal project, it was part of a much larger, shadowy initiative involving surveillance technologies and military applications. The information connected his work to global security contracts, and it seemed that people in positions of power had been using his research without his knowledge. He couldn't believe it. How could something that had started as a simple innovation for airport systems spiral into something this dangerous? Kevin felt a rush of nausea, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. This wasn't just a professional scandal, it was a conspiracy that stretched far beyond his understanding, one that he had unwittingly become a part of. "What the hell is this?" Kevin muttered, barely able to process the weight of the documents in his hands. He looked up at Thompson, his voice shaky. "Are you telling me I've been working for them?" The officer nodded slowly, his face impassive. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. You were chosen for a reason, Kevin. Your skills, your background, they fit the profile. They needed someone who could develop the technology without asking too many questions. You were a perfect candidate." Kevin's mind spun, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but not in the way he'd ever expected. The algorithm he had worked on so tirelessly, the one he thought was his ticket to making a real difference, had been hijacked. It had been twisted into a tool for control and surveillance. And worse, it was already in the hands of people who had no interest in transparency or ethics. Janice's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and demanding. "You need to tell us who they are. Who's behind this?" Thompson hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I can't tell you everything, but I'll give you enough to understand the stakes. This operation runs deep, and the people behind it, they don't care about anything but power." Kevin felt a pit form in his stomach. The revelation hit him hard. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, with no idea which direction to jump. He wanted to fight back, to expose the corruption, but the fear was crawling under his skin now. Whoever was behind, this wasn't going to let him walk away with this kind of knowledge. Not without consequences. Before he could process what to do next, the room's atmosphere shifted. The door opened again, and this time it wasn't just the officer. Another figure entered, someone Kevin instantly recognized. It was Captain Alvarez. Her arrival should have been reassuring, but the look on her face only deepened the tension. She wasn't here as a supporter, but as an enforcer. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, her voice steady but filled with a grim finality. She locked eyes with Kevin, And in that moment, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a glint of hesitation, almost as if she were trapped in this too. "Alvarez, what the hell is going on here?" Kevin's voice cracked with frustration and disbelief. She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Kevin, I never wanted you to get caught in this, but once you got too close to the truth, they didn't give me a choice." His mind raced. Alvarez, someone he thought he could trust, was part of this. Was she involved from the beginning? She had been the one person who had seemed genuinely supportive, who had tried to back him up when the airport security had shut him out. He had trusted her. And now she was revealing herself as part of the very system he had been fighting against. "It's not that simple," she continued, her eyes softening with what might have been regret. "I'm not one of them, but I've been forced to play along. They have leverage, and they knew you would uncover things they didn't want anyone to see." Kevin's head was spinning, trying to reconcile the captain he thought he knew with the person standing in front of him. What leverage? What do they have on you? Her jaw clenched. "It's not just me. It's everyone in positions like mine. If you push this any further, if you go public with what you've learned, they'll take everything. Your career, your freedom. They'll destroy you." Kevin's heart pounded in his chest, a surge of panic and rage filling his veins. He had been so focused on fighting against the system, he hadn't seen that he was already trapped in it. And now it seemed like the people he'd trusted most, Thompson, Alvarez, were all tangled up in something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But something inside him refused to give in. He wasn't going to let this be the end of his story, not when he was so close to the truth. He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor, and looked at Alvarez. "You think I'm just going to walk away from this? You think I'll let them bury this? Bury me? Just because they're threatening you?" Alvarez's eyes flickered with something, fear, or perhaps guilt, but she didn't say anything. It was Thompson who spoke next, his voice colder than before. "You're making a mistake, Kevin. You think you can fight back, but you're already out of your depth." Before Kevin could respond, the door to the room swung open again. This time, it wasn't just Alvarez and Thompson. A group of men and women in dark suits entered, their presence demanding. They were the ones Kevin had feared, the ones who controlled everything from the shadows, and now they were here for him. But just as they stepped toward him, ready to corner him, something unexpected happened. Alvarez stepped in front of Kevin, blocking their path. "Stop, you're not taking him." Everyone froze, their eyes locked on her. The tension crackled in the air, and in that moment, Kevin realized the truth. Captain Alvarez wasn't just protecting him, she was making a choice to fight back. She wasn't as trapped as she had led him to believe. She had power here too, and she was willing to risk it all for one last chance to make things right. "Get out of the way, Alvarez," one of the suited figures commanded, his voice dripping with authority. But Alvarez stood firm, her eyes burning with determination. "I'm done being your pawn." It wasn't over. It had only just begun, and in that moment, Kevin understood that this fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been controlled. The stakes had shifted, the game was changing, and the story was far from finished. The room was charged with electricity, the tension thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared to breathe too loudly. Alvarez stood her ground, facing down the group of shadowy figures in dark suits. Kevin could see the determination in her eyes, but also the uncertainty. She wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but she knew one thing for sure: this was her moment to stand up, to take back control. The suited figures exchanged glances, sizing her up, but none of them moved. For a moment, the power dynamic shifted. They were no longer in control, not as long as Alvarez was willing to challenge them. "Get out of the way, Captain," the leader of the group said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're up against." Alvarez didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not backing down." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin felt his heart pounding in his chest as the realization set in: This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. The moment when someone finally pushed back against the system that had held them all captive for so long. Alvarez stepped forward, her stance unwavering. You've been using people like Kevin for years, manipulating the truth, keeping us in the dark. But no more. If you want him, you'll have to go through me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one of the men in the back of the room moved forward, his face unreadable. Kevin instinctively tensed, ready for a confrontation, but the man didn't make a move toward him. Instead, he spoke. You don't understand, Captain. This isn't just about control. It's about power. The kind of power that can reshape everything. And you think you can just stop it? Alvarez's eyes didn't waver. I don't think I can stop it. I know I can. There was a pause, and then the man seemed to soften, just a little. You're brave. I'll give you that. But you're naive if you think you can undo everything we've built. Kevin stepped forward now, the weight of the folder in his hands suddenly feeling lighter. He had a choice to make. A decision that could either seal his fate or give him the chance to fight for something bigger than himself. You're right, Kevin said, his voice steady. I didn't know what I was getting into. But now I do, and I'm not backing down either. The man in the suit smirked, as if expecting Kevin to crumble under the pressure. But Kevin stood firm, looking at Alvarez, then at the man, then back at Alvarez. This wasn't just about the project anymore. This was about taking control of his life. About making sure that the work he had spent years developing wasn't twisted into something unrecognizable. We don't need to fight you, Kevin continued, his voice unwavering. We just need to make sure the truth gets out. The world needs to know what's really going on here. The man's smirk faltered. You think the truth matters. You think the public will care. You've seen how this works. You're just a pawn. Kevin's heart raced, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. Maybe we're all pawns, but even pawns can change the game. There was a moment of silence as the man's expression hardened. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned to his colleagues, nodding subtly. Do what you need to do, he said. The group moved in unison, but it wasn't towards Kevin or Alvarez. Instead, they moved toward the door. Kevin's mind reeled. Had they given up? Was it really over? Alvarez didn't let her guard down. You're not getting away with this, she said, her voice strong but measured. You'll answer for this, all of you. The leader paused before stepping out of the room. For now, he said, his voice cold, this is your victory, but it won't last, remember that. With that, the group filed out, leaving Alvarez and Kevin standing in the quiet aftermath. Kevin felt his breath slow, the adrenaline fading, but the weight of the moment was still heavy. They had won, at least for now. But the truth was, they knew this was just one battle in a war that wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Alvarez turned to him, a slight, almost imperceptible smile on her face. You did it. You actually did it. Kevin couldn't help but smile back, though it was tinged with exhaustion. We did it. But this isn't the end. We've got work to do. She nodded. I know. The world needs to hear the truth, and we're going to make sure they do. Kevin glanced down at the folder in his hands. The documents were evidence of a web of corruption and manipulation. They weren't just his key to exposing the truth. They were the key to dismantling an entire system built on lies. They had the power to bring it all down, to expose everything for what it truly was. But even as Kevin realized the gravity of their victory, a nagging feeling remained. The people they had just confronted were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. This was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Kevin felt a sense of hope, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a pawn anymore. As Kevin and Alvarez left the room, ready to face the next phase of their journey, the weight of the moment settled into the pit of his stomach. The world was watching now, and whatever came next, they were no longer fighting alone. They were fighting for the truth, for justice, for a future where innovation could be used for good, and not twisted by the hands of those who wanted to control it. The story was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Kevin felt ready.